this is right. Alright, now, even though we have contrast here, even though this character is facing left and this character is facing right, there's not enough contrast going on. If I were to animate this, this would kind of look boring, especially if I did an in-between. Oh, and one thing I want to mention about in-betweens, an in-between is basically the exact middle between two objects. So imagine this head is a ball, and I'm moving the ball from left to right. And in the last example, I had it going from fast to slow. So let's do slow to fast. But a perfect in-between between these two positions would be right in the center. That's called an in-between when it's a perfect in-between between two positions. Now a breakdown would be when it's not in the perfect center, when you're fiddling with the timing, so or the pose. So if I move the ball here, this is no longer an in-between, it becomes a breakdown because it's now not a perfect in-between. It's doing something else. Heck, if I moved it, you can also play with the timing and the position. So if the head was down here, you'd see that this makes the breakdown even more obvious. So that's the difference between an in-between and a breakdown. It's an important concept. Breakdowns give your animation that extra bit of life also. It's just another part of adding contrast to your animation. So left to right, I like both of these poses, but I need to add contrast. So if I'm going to animate between these two, I'm going to add a breakdown. So let's say, all right, let me move this guy to the, all right. So if you notice, here we have the character standing. So now in the breakdown pose, I'm going to have him kind of squatting. And notice his arms are facing to the left and sort of uppish, up and to the left, and they're sort of wide apart. So now I'm going to have them crossed and facing down. Oops, I forgot to draw the shoulders. So you get the general idea here. So the contrast between here and here is left to right, but the contrast from here to here is up versus down, and also stretch versus squashed. And yeah, so try to look for contrast in everything. I guess another way to call it is look for the opposites. They really add that extra bit of life to your animation. And also, so far I've only been talking about poses, but you can also look at timing, contrast in timing. That's why slow to fast looks interesting as opposed to an even speed going across the screen, because you have contrast. It's going from fast to slow. So you always want to try to have those things working. All right, so let's assume that I'm doing all right, if I'm animating the head from this left position to the squash position, I'm going to do a perfect in between, like I did in the first lesson. Just imagine the head is a ball, and then do an in between of that. Or you know what? In fact, better than that. We want things following arcs, not straight lines. Arcs look more graceful. So I'm going to put the head as sort of a breakdown, but also in between position-wise. So it follows an arc. And you do the same thing here, halfway through. So the head would sort of animate really quickly, and then slow in to this squash pose. And you do it again. Wait, let me redo that. So I'm adding a head between this location and the squash position. If you don't understand what I'm doing, just look at the last video that I did. It'll make sense. So he's going quick to slow. He's just going easing into this squash pose, and then I'll have him. All right, so and then I'll have him easing out to this pose, if you want. So the squashed head to the right head, keep it as an arc in between, and then I'll go backwards between. Oh, you know what? You can't even really read it, but you get the general idea. The other thing you want to animate are the arms and the spine. Notice I have, here's another place of contrast with the spine, where I have a curved spine in this pose, and in the squash pose it's straight. That's just try to add as much points of contrast that you can in your animation, from the pose to the speed to the timing to the size. Any form of contrast that you can get into your animation is only going to help. So here, if I were animating this, alright, no, I'm just going to animate the upper arm. If I had the upper arm, notice it's sort of facing 11 o'clock, and I wanted to eventually meet this squashed pose where the upper arm is facing, I guess, about 7 o'clock. So it's the same principle. You have it sort of following. This is why I talked about the points in the anatomy of a stick figure. You want to keep track of the shoulder joints. Make sure that it follows a nice smooth arc. Same with the elbow joint. Make sure it follows a nice smooth arc. You know, it'd be something like this. So a perfect in-between between these two would be, if this is 11 o'clock and this is 7 o'clock, this would be about, what is that? 8 o'clock, maybe? That's about 8 o'clock. And it's this upper arm is longer than this arm, but it's shorter than this arm. Because you notice it's sort of, should be the perfect in-between between the two. And then if I'm animating between these two arm positions in the next frame, it would be something like this. And in the next frame, it would be in between these two positions, something like this. So you get the general idea of how that works. And the same with the spine. You know, you gradually straighten this spine so that it becomes, so that it matches the length and straightness of the squashed pose. I hope what I'm saying makes sense, but this is the general idea. So the arm is going from fast to slow, and it's following these arcs of motion so that you won't have choppiness in the animation. It looks nice and buttery smooth. That's about it for contrast. And sometimes too much contrast is bad. If you're always having contrast, sometimes you want to contrast the contrasts with not so contrasty stuff to balance it out. Because contrast always gets boring. So sometimes you want to have contrast, not contrast. Contrast, not contrast. And just mix it up like that to keep things from getting monotonous. Anyway, that's my discussion of contrast. I hope it makes sense. It's actually a very, very, very big deal, as far as it was a big deal for me to get my animation from bleh to a lot better. And I don't know why people don't talk about this, because they should. It really is one of those secret ingredients, I guess, that isn't really discussed for some reason. Hope that helped, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks for watching. This is Darth Furby from the Lost Marble Anime Studio forums.